Hey guys, so today we're going to jump into something kind of near and dear to me, which is local record collecting, okay? And I'll give you a couple good reasons why, if it's not something that you've particularly been into, why you might want to think about it. I'll start off with the story of how I basically got into it. So going back to the 90s, my middle brother Tommy and I were starting to get pretty serious into collecting records. I think at that time mostly for inspiration for our bands. We were trying to find old music to be inspired by, and LPs were very cheap in the 90s. CDs were really expensive. We couldn't really afford many of them. LPs were like $1 everywhere. So we jumped into it pretty hard, and I think 5 or 10 years into collecting, we had maybe almost accidentally ended up with a couple local pieces. We had this sort of realization, I think, at some point, that as far as when you start searching for rarer records, like the highest chance of finding a rare record around you on any given day when you went out hunting was that probably it was going to be a local one. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, but I think the most obvious one is, these local records were usually made in small quantities. 500 is a pretty common number for a pressing total on a lot of these releases, whether it's an LP or a 45. And the reason for that is it was a plant minimum. So average pressing plants, they weren't going to press 10 copies of your record custom for you. It just wasn't worth it. So they usually had a minimum 500. So a lot of these groups, soul groups, rock groups, through punk and metal and everything, they just had to meet these 500 plant minimums. So 500 copies, and obviously these are not artists who are going to have great distribution, right? So their distribution, instead of like a major label, which would just have a network of distributors all over the country and possibly all over the world, local artists distributed their records usually fairly hand to hand. They either sold them at shows, maybe gave them away at shows. They probably dropped some off for local disc jockeys. I've seen them where you go into an old bar and you go through the jukebox and there's some local 45s in there where obviously the artist had dropped some off to try to get some local plays. So their distribution network was small, it was hand to hand, and also it had this radius around your city, and that was about it, right? So most of these people didn't have very many outlets to get their music outside the boundaries of the city that they lived in. So that's where you're going to find those records, okay? Whether it's a R&B group or whether it is a early hip-hop group or garage rock, psychedelic, whatever you're into, those records probably didn't travel more than 50 miles often. So you have a shot, of finding these things where you are. You're the one, if you're a digger wherever you are, whether it's Louisville or Little Rock or Los Angeles, you're the one, if you're out there looking at stuff every day, you have the highest chances of finding those records, right? Sometimes they surprise you and some of these little records pop up places where they shouldn't. It does happen. Things did move around, but I'd say for the most part, guess what? They're going to show up in the town where they're from. So we started to have a couple pieces we found. So I'm going to actually start talking today about this 45 Black Earth Plus. Song's called Milwaukee. You can't get more local than that. So, and this is kind of, I think, led Tommy and I to really catching the bug with this one, because we had a copy of this 45, right? And it's a good funk 45. It's a bit of a novelty track in the sense that, it's kind of just like proing Milwaukee really hard. A lot of just sort of, I think it was actually used as a kind of between DJ music on WAWA or WNOV really early on, a black radio station in Milwaukee in the early 70s. But anyways, we had this, not one of the rarest Milwaukee 45s, but a cool one. And Tom one day was driving down, I think it was Green Bay, and saw Black Earth Plus just straight up listed on this little marquee for this little sports bar. And he came back to our house and was like, yo, we gotta go see Black Earth Plus, like they're playing tonight at this sports bar. And we went, you know, and we end up meeting Ducci Rogers, who is the leader of this group, and they were playing, you know, a set of covers, and we jumped like about, maybe they were taking a break halfway through the show or whatever, and Tom and I went up to Ducci and we're like, hey, you guys gonna play Milwaukee in the next set? You know, and you say that to guys like this, and if, you know, we're like the only white kids at the bar too, right? So we already kind of stick out. But you say something like that to somebody like Ducci, and it really flips them out. You know what I mean? Like you get a really excited and positive reaction from these guys who haven't heard about these songs that they recorded back then for a long time. So of course Ducci, being a very cool guy that he was, literally asked Tommy and I to come. I don't think he even knew that we were musicians at all. Like he just thought we were just some random white kids off the street. He asked us during the second set to come up and play the song, and we kind of did. We like faked our way through it with him. It was a pretty easy song, but anyways, that just kind of maybe brings me to my second point about collecting local records. Is you can go meet a lot of times the people who made these and freak them out that you know about it, and especially if you like it, you know, it means a lot to them, right? To go and say that somebody, a generation and a cultural divide, you know, after them could completely absorb their art, and a lot of these things probably weren't very appreciated when they came out, so it was just like a really good feeling for us and a great feeling for him. So that brings me to the second point though, which is just like connecting to history from your town, right? And meeting some of the people who made these oftentimes incredible and neglected records from your city, who, you know, Tom and I, over the years, when we first started doing that, we were always shocked at some of these guys and gals that were in these groups. They lived half a mile away from where Tom and I did. You know, we probably ran into them, just saw them passing at the grocery store a million times before. You just didn't know there's just these layers of culture there, right? So that's just very cool. And like, this is us in Milwaukee, that's our experience. But honestly, go to Charleston or Portland, Maine, or whatever, like you have experiences like this. All these places have their independent records that they made, whether it's, you know, different styles or whatever. I'll just show you a couple other ones and some interesting things. This is a little bit of a, you know, preview episode that I'm making right now, because I am going to jump heavier into Milwaukee underground vinyl from the 60s, 70s, and 80s in a series, hopefully after this. But I just want to give a little taster. So a couple interesting things I'll show off. This is Berkeley Fudge. He is a local jazz musician, very famous. Didn't record a lot though. And this is just something that was made at UW Milwaukee in 1973. A really cool, very rare jazz LP. I've never seen another one. My friend Dante said he knows about one, I think, but I've never seen another one. Really cool. Milwaukee, not just you know, R&B and jazz and punk stuff. There's also a little bit of Latin there. So this is a big Latin record from Milwaukee from the early 80s, Orquestra Salsa Progresiva. Very sought after in recent years, but a cool early 80s kind of like traditional salsa, a little bit jazzy. This is a very famous one from Milwaukee, Penny Goodwin, Portrait of a Gemini. When we first started Lotus Land in the early 2000s, we could find a lot of these in the back of you know, the $2 sections of some of the old guy shops. But it was already a huge record in Japan for Too Soon You're Old, the amazing single. There's a 45 of it too, it's pretty rare. So Penny is still around. You know, we found this, we call Penny. You could go out to lunch with Penny and talk to her about the record. Like, she's still around. It is really amazing. This was made partially in Chicago with Richard Evans arranging it, and it kind of has a great feel to it. It's been sampled a bunch of times at this point, but you know, just a cool, she became a school teacher. She taught a lot of kids music after this, but this was back in the day. She wrote some of the things herself. She wrote Too Soon You're Old, the big tune herself, with Cy Lefko, the producer and musical arranger on the record. Anyways, that's a famous one. Here's a really cool one, Dazzle. This is an EP, okay, and this was a group that was originally called See on the Funk. They were a family band, kiddie band. I guess I'd say they started out as a kiddie band. They kind of became a little bit more of a not kiddie band because they, you know, it was a family. They stayed together for a while. But as they started, it was a kid group. It was a Smith family. Charles Smith was the C of See on the Funk. They kind of made a great 45, See on the Funk, In the Disco, and A Place. And then they made this with Kobe Joe Payne, another kind of legendary underground Milwaukee guy, a couple years later. This was an EP. These are pretty rare, okay? It doesn't even have a real proper album cover. A lot of these groups didn't even have enough money to do this, so this is just kind of a stick-on with their name. This record itself, great record if you're like early boogie, just kind of the cusp of disco and boogie sort of, right? It has some pressing flaws in it. So I don't think there's any outright skips, but there's a handful of jumps where the needle just jumps to the next groove, scattered throughout the record. And I've only had I probably had more copies of this than anybody else, but even that's like 3 or 4 copies have gone through my hands. They all have it, so it's just a pressing flaw. One of my guesses is some of these local records, they were made on such a low budget that they would have problems in the manufacturing sometimes, you know, and I think that with the Dazzle, my guess is that they chucked most of the copies because of that flaw and they didn't get out there, so it's pretty tough to find. Anyways, a couple 45s too. I will say about local collecting, 45s, name of the game here, okay? Most local groups just did not have enough money to record enough songs for an LP, let alone pay the increased production cost for making an LP versus a 45. Most local groups went into a studio, cut 2 songs. In Roy Turner's case, cut 1 song because it's a part 1 and part 2, and just maybe made 500. I don't even know if this one was a 500er. But these guys did 45s. Most of the R&B groups and the punk groups and the garage rock groups, the Psych groups even, they just only had enough money to do a 45. So they'd come do their best original song, put it out, see if they could get any play off of it. This is a beautiful kind of anti-war early 70s track. A lot of 45 collectors will know Progress. Tom Gress is the owner and engineer of that. From the Chefs, Mr. Machine 45, arguably the best funk record to ever come out of Milwaukee. This is rarer though. This is Roy Turner, a great record. Almost kind of sounds like some, you know, Josh Davis, DJ Shadow sample that never happened. Maybe he didn't have a copy. Anyways, so I just want to kind of give a beginner like overview on sort of my take on local collecting, a little history on how I got into it. Over the next couple weeks and months, I really want to do a series of videos where we're really going to jump into one release at a time and talk about it for, you know, 5 to 10 minutes and just really get into it and get some of this Milwaukee history out there. I really encourage you, wherever you are and where you're watching this, to kind of like look out for some of these things, your version of this, whatever town that might be in, and see what you know, singles and LPs were made in these tiny quantities back in the day. It is very, like, it's a fulfilling process, and it can make you some amazing lifelong friends with some of these underappreciated artists. Okay, until next time, YouTube, see ya.